All right, welcome. Let's start.
All right. How do I close this? Okay. Yeah. So the interesting thing about the self for me is that it's still very much a mystery. We still don't really know what the self is. We don't have a cohesive idea that we can all point to and say, yeah, um, that's the self. Even though people have been contemplating this concept for thousands of years, um, we still don't know. And if you ask people, if you ask them about it, um, what are you or what is your essence? Um, Once you part the weeds, the superficialities, I would say, of what most people would um, list as being part of themselves, um, I think most people just throw their hands in the air, like, and it doesn't matter who it is. It could be someone who reflects on this constantly. I think there is a point where um, we really don't know what to point to when it comes to knowing the self. And then on the other hand, I think we take it for granted. So we take it for granted that human beings constitute a self. Um, um, we walk around um, thinking of ourselves as selves and treating other people as selves, as constituting a self. Um, so we are a self. We seem to think that we are selves, but it's still a mystery to what the self is. Um, so that's interesting. And I think there could be some categorical problems there because I know there is a lot of terms. So maybe if you want to clarify by what the kind of self that we're interested in talking about in this conversation, because certainly there's terms that like intersect, but it's not really what we're talking about, right? So, or maybe, okay, so what I'm talking about when I mean self, it is the subjective experience of what it means to be, period. Um, so it's the observer of thoughts. It's the idea of the executive self who sits in the control center. So our lives unfold, it seems, under the scrutiny of this witness, of this eternal witness that we intuit or we sense it's in our heads. So, um, so yeah, by self, it is the intuition that there is a self that overlooks everything else and has the experience of being a self, independent of the contents
That's a good
of
point.
our minds.
That's a good point. Yeah. So first of all, thank you for introducing the topic. Like you said, it's a topic that's equally mysterious and the thing that we're most acquainted with in our everyday lives. It's the thing that we have most direct experience of, which is the sense of unity, this uh, sense that I am experiencing oneself, right? And
Mhm.
so the point that you mentioned there at the end is interesting. In your definition of self, is that the self uh, experiences itself as such, regardless of the contents of experience. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting topic to delve into, and like you said, there are different ways to come at this topic. And the definition that you provided is basically, I think most sort of ideas of the self converge on that definition.
Mhm.
And there are different ways to scaffold to it, but essentially we want to probe a little bit where that comes from. Is it real? What does it mean to ask if it's real, etc. So in asking this question, or in trying to raise this question, we will skirt on certain views of the mind, certain ideas about uh, what is essential to the mind, or theories of mind, and then how theories about organismic unity and how those scale up to the mind.
Right.
So we could start. Did you have a starting point where you wanted to sort of go from there, or?
Well, I could talk about, um, I've kind of titled this the inventory experiment or the missing ingredient.
Right.
So if we, we said the intuition that there is an observer, separate from the contents or separate from the body. So
Right. It's known as the homunculus fallacy, or homunculus idea, the sense that there is this entity that's removed from basically
yeah,
the body, or removed from even the substrate that gives rise to, let's say, the mind. So we
right,
have the assumption that the mind is dependent on the brain, and the mind-body problem is essentially understanding that dependence. Right?
hmm
We say that it is dependent, but we have to sort of make sense of that dependence. And some of the sort of 20th century philosophical approaches to it have been to dispel this idea that there is a mind, as, for example, Gilbert Ryle does in The Concept of Mind. So the mind in Gilbert Ryle is this concept, whereas what really is going on is the physical substrate, and then we have the behavioral sort of outputs of the individual. And we'll later talk about how the individual, right, even presupposing that there are individuals, is somehow connected to the idea of self.
right,
But so these approaches tend to say that there's something illusory about this sort of higher level that we experience. And then through the cognitive revolution onwards, you have a kind of academic push to uh, behaviorism is basically waning, and there are theories that are postulating mental contents, and so that the intermediaries between you know environmental inputs and behavioral outputs, right? So there's obviously something going on, and what's going on is taking place in the brain, but brain science doesn't give us access to these mechanisms that are, for example, attention, perception, thought, and what its likeness. Sorry, I went a bit of on a tangent there, but
that's right. So yeah, you hit on a couple of points that that I was going to mention as well. So going off on the missing ingredient idea, which is, so we started um, with the intuition that there is someone overlooking everything we do. And so I know there is an angle that people have come at it, which is, well, okay, so let's list all the things that we think the self is, or that are associated with the self. And traditionally, that has been that's been categorized under body and mind, right? Like you mentioned, traditionally, um,
right. Yeah,
without saying whether that's true or not. So
there is some dualism that's present in many sort of belief
yeah,
systems and traditions.
that's right.
it gets articulated most formally in the West, and especially with early modern philosophy and Descartes. But some dualism is present across
Right.
systems. Yeah.
Yeah. So body, you have everything associated with the body. So, you can limbs, torso, brain, include the brain there. So matter. So we're talking about matter um, that exists in the physical world. And then by mind, we're talking about the psyche, which are these mental contents of the experiencer that the experiencer has. But still, there is a feeling that there's something missing, because if you do make that inventory, you're still going to come at a point where the feeling lingers. There is still something missing because we haven't uh, found the way we define the self, that we're still not pointing at that thing, right?
Locus.
Um,
Right.
yeah. So
Well, I think we're going to get to the point where it's whatever the locus is, it's going to be a complex interaction, assembly, and dynamic of distributed but interrelated moving parts. And that dynamism is gonna sort of realize the self, perhaps. But yeah, let's not get there
yeah,
yet.
right, right. And so, I mean, I see maybe two um, propositions. They're not mine, but and Gilbert Ryle uses. Um, so in response to that, so where is the missing piece? So let me just throw out there the university example. Are you familiar with the analogy that Gilbert Ryle gives? So I'll
Sure.
just explain it. Um, so we all know what a university is. So when I say university, you have an idea in your mind, right? It's clear what it is. But if you were to take someone to a university to show them the university, you would come across, so you could point to the dorm rooms, you could point to the lecture halls, you could point to the dining halls, the athletic center, etc. And so all of these um, concrete things, but that are not university. So you won't find a thing that is a concrete thing that is a university. And so what Ryle is saying is that we can use that analogy to dispel the mind-body dualism. And he says it's a categorical problem that started with Descartes.
Okay. So
Yeah, go ahead.
let's pause there for a second. So there's a reading of that analogy or metaphor that I think doesn't capture the problem, and then there is a more charitable reading that I can do as well. So I think Leibniz had a similar kind of thought experiment where he says if you were to, you know, blow up the brain, right, and you were this like minuscule thing walking along its halls, you would not be able to see uh, thoughts, or you would not be able to actually see any of the contents. It will not. There is no way to actually gain access to to the mind that way. I think it was Leibniz, but yeah. To go back to Ryle's idea of the category mistake. So on the one hand, the category mistake is taking an example from language and the way that language has this property called displacement that allows the creation of concepts. We can talk about what concepts are that do not have direct analogs to experience. So the idea of a university or a city, these are kind of like at some level of abstraction, and they do have real world correlates, but they're not, so to speak, as concrete as say a chair or a, you know, a table, a person, right? They're not what are called genus level categories. And so I think Ryle's example is saying that the mind is something akin to this collection of stuff, right? But it doesn't correspond to one thing, right?
That's right. So yeah, so the Ryle's analogy, what Ryle is saying is there is no missing piece. Well, I mean, he's talking about the mind here, not the self specifically, and we're talking about the self, but they're related. But it's an aggregate, so it's the collection, it's the cohesiveness of the separate elements. So I'm going back to the self now and the way I thought about it. So there is just so I guess one idea of thinking about it. There is just the contents, so the inventory, the list, and together they create this emergent property, which is consciousness. And then we can also, that maybe it's a separate discussion, how self comes from consciousness, because there is, I mean, animals are conscious, but where is the self in consciousness? Even if we are, well, so I guess it is the awareness of external and internal existence.
Yeah, so a couple of points there. On the one hand, so the the Riley metaphor is trying to dispel the idea of mental contents, and I think that is no longer the consensus. And I would agree with the kind of post-behavioralist consensus that there are mental contents, right? But we don't know how to uh, formulate a theory about them that, like you said, posits the right relation to the neural substrate or the kind of like the neural processing that's going on at the purely physical level, let's say. And there are ideas that there is what's called identity theory, which is saying that the contents, right? Let's say your beliefs or your desires or the more kind of ineffable feels, raw feels that don't have necessarily what are called propositional content, or they don't have uh, kind of like the difference between a pain and the belief that you're in pain, right? The pain is more direct. The belief that you're in pain is more abstract, more thought-like. And that these have an identity with certain neural ensembles, right? They're identical. There is no difference between them. So this is one way that that Ryland tradition gets carried on, even though it's not identical to his position. But then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if we say that they're identical, if we go with identity theory, and some version of identity theory probably has to be true, but then we want to parse identity theory so that we don't lose the explanatory power. So we don't yet have a description at the neural level that can give us mental contents, right? And so mental contents, again, they can be cushioned as these things like beliefs, desires, thoughts, but also
Right.
what it's like,
Yeah.
feels, and perceptions, and things like that.
Yeah.
However, like you said before, the self seems to be in the background of all of this content, right? So there is a tradition that goes back to Kant, and it's still kind of alive today, that and gets taken up through certain strands of phenomenology, that posits that on the one hand you have what's called transitive consciousness or awareness. And by transitive, that's just a kind of a philosophical term of art, but it means that your awareness is of something, right? So right now I'm aware of you, I'm aware of the room, right? So there is a directedness to my mental uh, contents and to my mental activity, right? It's directed towards object. Now the question is all of awareness of such a character? And one of the theories is that no, it's not all of such a character. There is non-transitive awareness, and this non-transitive awareness is this uh, unity of experience, this sense that one is experiencing. And you brought this up at the very beginning, where you said that to define the self, you also have to define this kind of recursive looping back onto itself, right? So every experience that you have of an object that's transitive is accompanied simultaneously by experience, and this is not necessarily explicit, that one is experiencing.
That's right.
What is that one, right? So that's the real question. And there are some sort of theories in embodied mind and an activist cognitive theory that get into this, and maybe we can actually get into that in another meeting. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that out. And
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what you talked about. So the transitive experience, so the awareness that's directed to something, um,
second,
is that, what's that?
second order to the first order experience that one is experiencing, right? All awake states are accompanied by this oozing kind of just sense of experience, and there are different. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so yeah, so so yeah, as I understood the con thing, the transitive experience of um, so being aware or in relation. So that's the relational self, which is always in relation to something else, another object outside. And then behind that, there is another meta awareness, which is aware of um, um, what is, what.
Experiencing, right?
That's right.
Awareness, and that awareness is not necessarily. So there's this like tradition in Western philosophy that's all about what's explicit, right? So explicit beliefs. So this is not necessarily an explicit belief, right? It's not a it's not a propositional content necessarily. And
Right.
I know that's a kind of a dropping these terms of art that might not mean anything to the general audience, let's say, right? Propositional contents.
Yeah.
But if I can really quickly explain what that is, it's propositions are supposed to be intermediaries between thoughts and verbal output or written output. So a sentence expresses what? A proposition. And a proposition, there are theories about what are propositions, right? But it could be structured, right? It could have a kind of a loose mapping of object predicate kind of internal structure, right? So I am aware of you, right? Like that sentence, right? Or I have a desire to publish, right? There is there's an object, and then there is uh, a predicate that saturates that object.
I think there is a connection here. Yeah, and I'll bring in Buddhism. I think there is a connection about the way of describing the self, which is, so I think, are we at a place where we could say that's what we're trying to get at? So the meta awareness.
Yeah. So yeah, the meta awareness is.
So yeah. and so let me just finish what I was about to say. Um, because so that relational self reminded me of something in Buddhism. Um, so if you're familiar, so the Buddhist, the project that the Buddha set out was to, it was a massive, I mean, it was to alleviate people from suffering. I mean, that was the goal that he had in mind. And he said, so he came to this conclusion that our that all of suffering or most of suffering is a cause of us um, thinking that that we are self, so us being tied to the illusion of the self. So he said that the way to break that is to come to terms that there is no self, and enlightenment is that. So breaking through the self illusion. And but what I so the Buddha said that or in Buddhism, the self is analogous to the ego, which is really desire. So, and we can get to the relational part because desire
Uh,
is always in relation to something. So, desire to be this or that, or desire to do this or that. And there is this idea there of clinging to our desires. Um, and this clingingness causes suffering, according to the Buddha, this clinging to our relational self. And there is this difference between relational self that is described, where our state, our mental state, is um, is caught up in another object, so outside of ourselves. So small mind. So in other words, that's small in Buddhism. It's small mind, and then uh,
yeah.
big mind is when you lose that relation and it's just awareness. Yeah.
So
Just wanted to throw that in there.
interesting kind of direction to go in. A couple of things. So I want to push against this idea that uh, that the self. So yeah, suffering is tied to this idea of self, and self is mired in desire, and you get rid of desire, you get rid of suffering. So, well, first of all, the experience of desire is real, right? And the experience of that one is experiencing. So saying that that's an illusion, that's a claim, and that's a claim that's maybe we could push against.
Mhm.
So whether, how can I say this? So what is really desire, right? Desire is just the want that the self or the unity, the organismic unity, will will achieve certain outcomes, right? So there is this connection to these outcomes. And what are these outcomes, right? Well, in part, a lot of the outcomes are culturally relative, but they are culturally relative against a core of what we can call, evolutionary success, or it's called reproductive success in evolutionary theory, right? So there is a context in which the organism wants to, survive, and it also wants to flourish. And survival and flourishing aren't really distinct; they're on a spectrum. So this asymmetry, this interestedness in the world, is fundamental to any sort of organism. Any system that's non purely, don't want to say physical, but that's organized in a way that it uh, seeks its own survival and propagation. So I think all of desire reduces, and I don't want to say reduces in kind of like it means that it's illusory. It's explained by this asymmetry that arises in nature. Uh, we don't know how it arose, right? We have theories about how what we call life arose. The very distinction between life and non-life is still debated, right? The cleavage between a physical system and a physical system that we call living is a bit blurry, but there is a theory out there, and there are several theories about what are the necessary and sufficient conditions to call a system sort of living. And one theory is what basically is called autopoietic unity or organizational unity. And the autopoietic unity is the idea that you have a recursive loop or network, right, that realizes its own boundary between itself and the world, right? And so the processes that create the boundary are dependent on some internal dynamic obtaining, and then that internal dynamic is maintained in turn by the creation of this boundary. So at the organismic level, right, we can articulate some sort of description, right, that is a correlate to a complex organism that's more scaled up, like such as ourselves. And so I think selfhood is intimately tied to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is, so I want to read this part by, so there's Douglas Hofstadter. You've heard of Gödel. He's like the famous author of Gödel and some other books. His idea is that, and I don't agree with all of his ideas, his idea is that the self is a tangled heterarchy. Or what he calls a strange loop. It would be kind of fun to read this particular passage here about how he explains what a strange loop is. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Yeah, so imagine that there are three authors, Z, T, and E. Now, Z exists only in the novel by T, but T exists only in a novel by E. And E exists in a novel by Z. So which of these is real, right? And well, what he says is that there has to be an author H in which all of these authors are fictional characters of, right? And by H, he means this is the physical substrate. And in his kind of trying to understand how we scale up from the physical substrate to the mental substrate is that there is a sense in which the mental substrate can reach back onto itself and modify itself, but it cannot modify the language by which it operates, which is the neural substrate.
Right.
So if you think about this loop of Z, T, and E, there is no precedence. Neither author here has precedence of existence, right? Neither is higher in a hierarchy. And he thinks that self is this kind of strange loop where we can sort of represent ourselves, and that the self concept is this sort of tangled loop that is realized by the software in our brains.
Right. Yeah. There's also this, other part to this idea of selfhood, which is that we have no insight into other people's selfhood. And what your example kind of made me think that, yeah, everyone else is kind of a fiction that we in our own heads, right? Our encounter with other people, we are we are their authors in some sense. Our mind authors the people we encounter, um, which is that, yeah. So the self we described at the beginning of this, which is the experience of what it means to be a human being or a self-aware. Um, we only have insight into our own selves and not others. So, so of course we have to grant that other people have selves just as us, but we have no way of knowing that.
Right. We have
No direct.
entry into another person's interiority or thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, and so going back to the Buddhist thing, just want to say that uh, i- i- so in Buddhism there is a distinction. The Buddha never meant to so get rid of desires. I think that's a an impossibility. We can get rid of desires, but the idea there was not to equate ourselves with these desires, because then we get tied down to, we become slaves to them. So this was so freeing ourselves from our desire. The project was taming, how to tame our own mind. Um, um, but so talking about that, so going back to that relational self, which is always in relation to an object.
Well,
And well, let me just finish. And that so it does perturb us. A lot of self-imposed suffering is the cause of that relation. And that even in psychology, fear and anxiety, of course, are mental contents tied to awareness. So there is this neuroscientist that says um, we don't experience so let's say we're in the wilderness, right? And we see a shadow, or we see the leaves moving or something, and we're aware that there is some foreboding thing there. And so first what happens is the body goes into shock. So that's the instinctual primal body reaction, right? But fear, he says, is not part of that. Fear happens in another part of the brain. And fear is the result of then the us, or the mind, being aware of the situation. So the awareness of the situation adds another layer of fear and anxiety, and because we're running through all these scenarios of we're going to die, we're not going to see our loved ones again, or whatever.
well, exactly.
And so,
Yeah.
and so when I saw him talk in a podcast, he had this shirt that said "No self, no fear," which was interesting because I think it is applicable in everyday life to be less self-aware. I don't know if you get what I'm saying. Does that make sense to you? Hyper awareness is just it can be horrific if you're too self-aware.
It's
If you give too leeway to that,
criminalizing.
yeah. If you pay too much attention to the awareness behind you, and sometimes it's good to like not have that meta awareness, or you know tone it down. um yeah, I think that's another interesting thing.
Well,
Yeah.
I think you brought up two really good points. One is that Well, it just seems that whatever consciousness that we have as humans, which I do think is in some continuity with animal consciousness, right? We're animals as well. But whatever extra ingredients that we have are a huge burden. This so awareness, self-awareness, right? Which is a bit of a begging the question, because whether the self exists is what we're debating, or what is the self. But awareness of self a massive, is a really taxing property is a really taxing property of the human being. And it's possible that a lot of religious traditions evolved certain narratives and certain techniques to alleviate that taxing taxing fact of the matter. The other thing is that you brought up is when this becomes a little pathological, or if certain people, or not just certain people, but it's certain experiences that induce, a level of self-awareness that leads to a paralysis of action. Or I think this is tied to what you were describing, is tied to social situations where how we're perceived by others becomes an extremely sort of uh, awareness of perception by others is is what causes this pathology or this anxiety. And I think that this anxiety is probably experienced to some degree by everybody, and and it can vary in terms of, and then it can vary. It can be a little pathological, or it can be like unlearned by certain techniques. But I think that the reason why it's there is because a great deal of our cognitive resources, our mental activity, is awarded to social, uh, I don't want to say the cliche words, but social belonging, social fitting in, uh, sociability, right? So because as a species we evolved in groups, and a great deal of what we have achieved is because we have been able to cooperate with others. And so this kind of fear of how we will be perceived by others, I'm just sort of like just kind of riffing here, but is tied to that, is tied to the fact that a great deal of our mental activity, a great deal of our thoughts and planning is actually awarded to dealing with others, how
Hmm.
others feel, what others are thinking. And so we have this amazing capability of ascribing mental contents to other human beings, ascribing intentions, ascribing similar things that we experience internally. And these ascriptions are integral to our environmental maneuvering. So the
That's right.
environment that we are mired in is not just a physical environment, but it's predominantly, and first of all, most primordially, a social one. Not all species are as social, but I think uh, humans are. So I think when we talk about mentality and we talk about desire, these are always tangled with social outcomes, and there are group dynamics that constrain the way that that desire then gets articulated in a particular type of group with certain particular preferences. And of course, we can say that there is overlap of preferences across groups, right? And that's where certain, base morality comes out of. And these are preferences that we want to sort of, the group has certain preferences for its own cohesion, right? And so they don't want members who will undermine that cohesion. So a great deal of fear and desire are tied to these sort of group dynamics. But, and so I think consciousness and awareness are doing a great deal of work in this respect. But again, I agree with you And I think the Buddhist teachings do a lot of work in terms of alleviating this burden, or making us one step removed from it.
Mhm.
So I can completely imagine that there are great swaths of the population that do not engage in this type of meta awareness, and there are many great swaths that do, where they realize that this is the case, and
Mhm.
then they try to act in such a way where their awareness that this is the case, and saying that awareness is the case, is a representation of what the world is like, including themselves in it, right? Changes their behavior. And this seems to be part of the locus of what the self is, which is that this ability, right? This ability for reflection, and then modifying ourselves in light of reflection, seems to be what the colloquial, well, not just the colloquial, but part of what part and parcel of what we think of as the self. And one of the kind of things that Hofstadter wants to both confirm and dispel is that this sense that we can modify ourselves is both overstated, because we can't obviously modify our personality, we can't modify the vast majority of traits we can't modify, but there is a sense that we can modify certain things, and that modification is tied to uh, this self-reference, this reference of this internal representation of some unity.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, and road rage. I mean, road rage is a good example of that. Um, yeah. So right. So we recognize so having the subjective experience that we have of ourselves, um, we recognize that other people are also have that. So in their behavior, but we do expect them to act a certain way. Um, so that expectation, so the ought that is always lingering. Um, so as a human being, you ought to act a certain way. And when someone breaks that code, whatever that is for you, then you get angry. So I I heard it somewhere. I heard this example, which I thought was good. So if someone does if you're driving and someone cuts in your line or whatever, you automatically become emotionally charged.
An automatic response, yeah,
Yeah,
of wrongness, of injustice.
of wrongness. That's right, because you have an expectation of how you first recognize it's another human being, and then how they
How they
ought to act in that situation or behave. But if an animal runs across the street and you get into a major accident, you do not have that experience. So you don't get emotionally charged at all.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, because you recognize that it's not a human being. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't know better, right? Um,
So there's a lot of cognitive process. There's a lot of information processing that is going on to actually induce this response that we're calling near automatic, right? So there are many uh, antecedent assumptions, such as, yeah, human being is, and once we once we sort of fix the category of human being as the culprit, then there are attendant assumptions that they have, capability to control themselves, that they ought to comply with the rules, and that their sort of diverging from the rules has somehow, infringed on your sphere of freedom, or whatnot. So all of that processing is happening
yeah.
extremely fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So if I could, we're coming at the hour mark. I don't know if what happens because I scheduled it for an hour. Does it shut down? Does it kick us off or what happens?
But so
Something might happen, but
but so real quick, there was a real another point there. So this sense of injustice that we experience, periodically in our experience of the world, implies a kind of interested identity, right? There is there is an identity, and we haven't gone into discussing how this identity is in part a social construct, and how we perceive ourselves has some layer of social and relativity, right? In different times, people perceive themselves differently. So this is the kind of chasm between ideology, which is sometimes hidden, and actual more divorced facts. But what we're really discussing is that separate from the ideology, there's still something there, even if you didn't have the ideology, right? Even if the human being was, let's say, living in a completely different world or in a different time, that there is something in common, and that there's
right.
common. Now, how you perceive that sense of injustice might vary from culture to culture, and how quickly or what stimulus induces that, but that there is this sort of uh, organismic unity. This is what seems to me that you can't deny.
That's right. Another way I like to think of that is if you think of yourself at every stage of your life. So if you do a timeline and then you point at yourself at, let's say, 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever, you you don't deny that there is an enduring essence in you that's still in you, even though your um you've changed, your body has changed, your mind has changed, how you look at things. So you're so changed from how you were when you were 8, in every way, but there is an enduring thing in you that's still in you, and you can intuit that, you can feel that, but not. Huh?
What would you call that, for example?
What would I call it? Well, the self is
It's
what we're calling it, right?
right. It's a
I
pattern, right? It's a pattern that's realized both physically and at the higher, what we call the mental, and we have a hard time assimilating the mental, but we think that is a dependent on the physical, right? It's realized through all these processes, all of like each of the system in the body that's coding for proteins and doing its job. What what my thesis would be is that all of these processes have an organizational closure. And by that I mean something really prosaic, which is that you are separate from another person and you are separate from your environment. And what this organizational closure is maintaining at the really base is, the internal dynamic, ensuring that the internal dynamics of the system are taken care of, right? So you have to maintain a certain, temperature inside. It's called homeostasis. But the higher levels, what we have is this planning and these other desires for reproductive success, for being accepted in a social group, and for contributing to that group and being recognized for it. All of these are continuous with this organizational closure, or this unity that we are. And but I agree with you that a lot of these meta theories, right, about being aware of ourselves and not falling into all, not being constantly sort of mired in this sense of self, does alleviate a lot of the pressure and a lot of the, it can create well-being, right? Because there's a huge burden that comes with being not just a self, but a self that knows that it is itself. It knows that it can die, things like that.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And it seems like it didn't kick us out. It's still recording, so I guess it's fine.
So let's go maybe like 10 more minutes.
Yeah. Um, I did have a thought there when I thought we were going to be kicked out, like as to end this. I think we talked. So we talked about the ought, the expectations we have. Um, um, what I was going to say is, I mean, because we have to address the question of why is it important to even talk about this? Because we could just go about our lives. We don't really have to, you know, mull about if it's real or not, or what it is, or it doesn't really change our life. But I think there is something important there that, um, so first of all, the desire to seek after oneself is there. I don't choose that. That is just the way it is. So so um, um, the striving, so the inquiry into what the self is. So, but what I was going to say is the way. So we have this um, third person point of view over ourselves. We call it the meta self, and I think it's important to pay attention to the meta self because it tells us a lot about what the human being is. So it gives us an insight into what we are. And if you don't pay attention enough to that, you can lose some important information about what we are. Now, the other important thing is that we don't cut other people enough slack. And I want to relate it to what's happening socially right now, is that when we do something wrong, we can overcorrect. Immediately, our brain overcorrects. Um, we don't tend to do that with other people. We're very cutthroat with other people. That's because we don't um, we don't factor in intentions. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. You know, sometimes,
We ascribe too much intention sometimes
or
because
that's right.
we're wired to ascribe intentions, and you see that this in religious stories where they kind of make that category mistake with nature, but sometimes
Yeah,
things happen randomly or without intention completely, right?
right.
But sorry, yeah, finish it.
I mean, yeah. So if I mean, if you're in a circumstance where you do something and let's say you hurt someone else, but your intention wasn't to hurt someone else, you walk away from that saying, "Oh, you know, what's wrong with that person?" Right? So, so because you have that point of view of yourself, you know your intentions, and so you are behind the scenes there. Um, whereas if someone else does something, you're very quick to judge on other people. But I do think that meta awareness, being aware of that, does give us an insight into a whole range of what the human being is capable of doing. And then realizing that and also realizing that in other people, I think is important in how we deal with other people and how we live our lives.
Yep, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, yeah, I think when I come at the topic, I come with these sort of more philosophical or scientific way of uh, trying to zero in on a description that I think is consistent with all these other beliefs that I have. But I think another avenue into the topic is this internal analysis, or rather, this broadening of the awareness, or this turning of the mind's eye towards one's own experience, one's own reactions, one's own thoughts, and trying to parse that.
Right.
And I think that that's extremely valuable and rewarding. Yeah, and I think that even next time we could get into some of the ways that I am interested in a little bit in phenomenology and how phenomenology creates certain tools for analyzing the way that the present moment is experienced, for example, from moment to moment. And this is getting into the more nitty gritty of what is being realized
Hmm.
that we experience in a completely uh, involuntary way, right? This this loop, this kind of network that constantly realizes this present. There has to be a lot of work that's done to get to this present.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there is the whole mountain, right? Summit of of thoughts that you're referring to that are often reactionary to other people or uh, one's own sort of desires getting tangled in and being aware and sort of turning your mind's eye towards them is and analyzing them in a way that's with some distance is an interesting path.
Yeah. If this was a if this was a self-help podcast, we would maybe end on there is like a balance there, a sweet spot between hyper self-consciousness and a lack of self-consciousness, right? So so being in that sweet spot is where you want to be, because I've experienced both, right? And hyper self-consciousness can be horrific. You don't want that. And lack of self-consciousness, I don't know, because I was just born with this brain that is always aware of what it's doing, and it's interested in the awareness. It's keying in on the awareness. But I don't think everyone has that. I don't. Some people are pay less attention to that, or they're less self-conscious. For sure, yeah.
Yeah, and this goes into what people call presence and
Yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah.
yeah. So there is a distinction between, and I think of perhaps our ancestors. There is a pathology that's called rumination, where a minor event causes brain activity and thoughts that are in disproportion to that minor event. And this is pathological for the flourishing of that individual because you are, expending all of these cognitive resources to basically deal with this infraction. Obviously, there are infractions where you need to give mental resources to. So, so yeah. On the other hand, this interiority, right? This rich internal life. I think it comes in a spectrum. Some people have a richer interiority because, for whatever reason, it has to do with their upbringing, their genetic makeup, and other people are more present in the external stimulus. But I do think, as humans, we have this. We have a much. The interiority is the hallmark of
Mm.
of, of what we are to some extent, right? We are not just experiencing the present, but for the most part, we are planning for the future. And
Yeah.
for the most part, we're planning for the future. And the how far we cast those plans into the future is a function of culture. And on another level is a function of this ability that we have to have a modular representation of the outer world within our minds. And part of the cognitive competency that allows us to do that is language, right? A language allows us to represent the world at a level of granularity that mere perception or non-linguistic symbols could not. And so, in possession of language, then and giving this richer and more granular, complex representation of the outer world, which is both, you know, physical, social, it's a complex tangle of stuff, allows us to cast our plans further into the future. I think living for the future is extremely burdensome, but I do think that as a human, you cannot flourish unless in some part you are moving towards the future in the right way.
Yeah.
And so all of the sort of other behavioral, the more local behaviors, right? The perception of the computer, the perception of the person, all of this stuff happens in a larger stage of these futural goals. And
Hmm.
they're kind of nested within each other. And this is why I like that Heidegger says that the world reveals itself, right? It reveals itself. You can't even get to it without this context of purposiveness. And the largest purposiveness is this longer term goal orientedness. So
Right.
yeah, in so many words.
Yeah, that was a really good uh, riff there. And yeah, you mentioned some stuff that we could talk in future podcasts about the role of language, which is, crucial in our mental modes and how we abstract things and all that, and how we interact with reality and ourselves. Um, so, what do you think? Should we end it there?
Yeah, I think this is a good place to end.
All right, this was fun.
It was fun, yeah. I thank you for, yeah, this was great. Thank you for, you know, being willing to participate in this. This was
Yeah.
fun exercise.
Should I? I'm gonna stop recording here.
Okay.
Um, let's see.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I stopped recording.
okay. I do think that we kind of went in many different directions, and if we want to do another one, we can be more focused and sort of
Mhm.
have a more have a lower threshold of kind of what we're trying to articulate and focus on one thing and then riff off that. What do you think?
Mhm. Yeah, sure. So should we could talk about the future, the next podcast, but it could be part two of the self if you feel that there's things that were left unsaid or you wanted to talk more about it. Um,
Sure. Yeah, I think we did cover a lot. Uh, but what do you think? Is there some outstanding kind of topics we can get into, like the idea of self-reference? If you're interested in that, we can get into self-reference, and this idea of the minimal awareness or non-transitive awareness.
mhm.
And maybe
Yeah.
we could do a Buddhist reading, like a direct, and then
That,
try to do a close reading of that.
mhm, mhm. We could. We could. Um, okay, so yeah, so let's think about the next one, what we want it to be. If it's a part two, then um, we could come prepared for that. Were you recording as well here?
Yeah.
Okay.